Operation Barbarossa wasn't just an invasion. It was Hitler's most ambitious, bloodiest, and most decisive blow, and the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. In the summer of 1941, dawn on June 22nd splits history in two. While thousands of planes take off and German trains groan eastward, the radio in Moscow still plays as if nothing were happening. Between those two worlds beats an idea that changes everything: living space, ideological war, and blind faith that the USSR was a colossus with feet of clay. Barbarossa wasn't just an invasion. It was an all-in gamble. Caucasus oil, Ukrainian wheat, and victory before the first snow. It meant maps covered in arrows, and roads swallowed by mud. Radios ordering forward, engines refusing to start at -30 degrees Celsius. Encirclement after encirclement until the calendar and Soviet resistance told the Wehrmacht enough. But how did Germany go from lightning triumphs to a never-ending front? Why did Stalin ignore so many warnings? What weighed more, ideology, logistics, or climate? And at exactly what moment did the myth of German invincibility crack in front of Moscow? Today, we're going to tell Barbarossa step by step. The secret build-up, the blow of June 22nd, the giant pockets, the Rasputitsa, the winter, and the counter-offensive that saved the capital. Clearly, without embellishment, and with respect for those who lived the war in their homes, not just on the maps. But before we begin, if you're new to the channel, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we break down campaigns and battles that changed the world. What happened, why it happened, and what it left behind. And now, let's begin. After conquering France in 1940 and pushing Great Britain off the continent, Hitler felt invincible. The formula for victory seemed indisputable: rapid blows, concentration of force, flexible command, and a tactical air force that dislocates the enemy before it can regroup. After the defeat of Norway, Germany secured Swedish iron and a strategic window onto the Atlantic. And in the spring of 1941, the campaigns against Yugoslavia and Greece reaffirmed the Wehrmacht's prestige and fed the idea that the Reich could open fronts in multiple directions and still keep its momentum. In Berlin's eyes, modern war already had a manual: surprise, speed, and annihilation by encirclement. Beneath that confidence, though, beat an uncomfortable truth. Germany lacked essential resources. The Reich's war economy needed oil for its panzers and air force, rubber for tires, special metals for armor, and above all, food to sustain millions of civilians and soldiers. Domestic reserves were limited, and the British blockade made overseas trade costly and difficult. On the High Command's maps, the East appeared as the answer. Caucasus oil, Ukraine's black soil grain, and a broad range of Soviet raw materials promised to feed the German war machine. The USSR and Germany were two regimes that detested one another, yet in 1939 they signed the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. The agreement partitioned Poland, assigned spheres of influence in the Baltic states, and opened an intense trade route between them, a marriage of convenience that bought both sides time. For Stalin, it provided breathing room to rearm. For Hitler, freedom to crush France without fear of a second front. But both leaders knew the pact was a temporary bandage, not a long-term commitment. For Hitler, communism was Germany's absolute enemy. The war, therefore, should not be a limited campaign, but a crusade to destroy the Soviet state and decapitate its elite. In that logic, the key word appears: Lebensraum, living space, a plan that combined military conquest with colonization and exploitation. Ukraine was to become the Reich's breadbasket, the Caucasus its fuel pump, and the Slavic peoples a pool of labor to be subjugated or displaced. On the Soviet side, contradiction reigned. Stalin didn't trust Hitler, but he feared provoking a war before he was ready. The purges of 1937 to 1938 had mutilated the Red Army's officer corps and degraded the quality of command. The Red Army was growing and modernizing, but with friction, fragile communications, and incomplete combined arms coordination. Even so, Soviet industry increased output. T-34s and KV tanks appeared, and the goal was to build a force capable of withstanding heavier blows in the near future. In 1941, with Great Britain still standing and the United States edging toward the conflict, Hitler identified a window of opportunity. He believed that if he destroyed the USSR in a short campaign, London would be isolated with no hope of continental relief. A quick victory would also solve the Reich's energy and food shortages and cement its hegemony over Europe. The High Command's doubts about the length of supply lines, the seasonal mud, and the Russian winter existed, but confidence in the Blitzkrieg formula seemed to paper them over. For Hitler, invasion wasn't just an option. It was the logical consequence of his ideology and his war economy. For Stalin, the risk was real, but the hope was that prudence and preparation would be enough to postpone it. Trains kept running, diplomats kept paying visits, and on the front, ammunition, fuel, and maps piled up. Everything heralded a storm that, when it broke, would aim not only to defeat an enemy, but to forcibly remake a continent's fate. From late 1940, the German High Command outlined Operation Barbarossa. Officially, nothing existed. Unofficially, the eastward invasion would absorb the fuel, steel, and rail cars needed to keep the Reich going. The goal: destroy the Red Army in frontier battles, occupy the political and economic heart of the Soviet Union, and force its collapse before climate and logistics turned against them. Entire units began to move. Bridges were reinforced, rail lines widened, depots of ammunition and fuel sprang up, camouflaged in forests. Engineers did their math. Surveyors measured roads and crossing points on the Dvina, the Dnieper, and the Bug. Meanwhile, military intelligence built a picture of the foe. Fortifications, rail hubs, airfields, command centers, radios. Aerial photographs were archived. Routes for motorized columns were traced. Targets for the Luftwaffe were marked with a level of detail that impressed even veterans of the French campaign. The planned sequence was clear, almost choreographed. Breakthrough, exploitation, encirclement, annihilation. The same recipe that had worked in Poland, France, Yugoslavia, and Greece, now at an unprecedented scale. Headquarters repeated the optimistic line: destroy the covering armies on the border, and the Soviet structure will collapse within weeks. Their centralized administration will unravel. 3 to 5 months at most, preferably before the autumn rains and certainly before winter. To do it, the Germans were willing to stage the largest land deployment in history to that date. Over 3 million soldiers in roughly 150 divisions, including 19 panzer divisions. Backed by more than 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, around 600,000 motor vehicles, and over 700,000 horses. And in the sky, to support them, the Luftwaffe had mobilized more than 2,500 aircraft. The operation took the shape of 3 army groups. In the north, Army Group North would drive through the Baltic states, secure crossings of the Dvina, and push toward Leningrad, the great Baltic port and symbol of the revolution. Its fall would isolate the Soviet fleet, ease a link-up with Finland, and close the northern pincer. In the center, Army Group Center concentrated the greatest armored power. Panzer divisions and motorized corps to punch holes, wheel rapidly, and bag large enemy formations. Its decisive objective was Moscow, the rail, industrial, and political hub par excellence. In the south, Army Group South would enter Ukraine, capture Kiev and the Donbas, and open the route to Caucasus resources. Each group had its mission, but all shared the doctrine: speed, combined arms coordination, and destruction by encirclement. Hitler, omnipresent, shored up confidence. He repeated that the USSR was a colossus with feet of clay, that Bolshevism would crumble under cascading blows, that non-Russian nationalities would step aside or even help. His conviction set the tone. The war must be decided before autumn. No need to occupy every inch, he insisted. Just destroy enemy forces and seize key cities. A rapid victory also promised an economic prize: Ukrainian grain, coal, and iron from the Donbas, and beyond, Caucasus oil. All this would ease the British blockade and bring continental Europe under a single direction. With June's short nights approaching, the pieces clicked into place. Secrecy was no longer total, but the magnitude of the German build-up and its tempo would only be clear once the blow fell. Army group commanders received staggered directives. Corps commanders went over routes. The Luftwaffe assigned targets by hour and airfield. Radio ciphers were tested. Sappers packed charges. Interpreters reviewed Soviet maps. In the camps, troops cleaned weapons, oiled engines, and wrote letters. No one said tomorrow, but everyone felt it. Once the engines turned over, Europe's history would pivot hard to the east. At dawn on June 22, 1941, a long roar jolted Soviet outposts awake. Along thousands of kilometers, German artillery fired in unison at barracks, command posts, ammunition dumps, and communications nodes. Minutes later, columns of tanks and trucks started up like a single machine. Operation Barbarossa had begun. Airfields in Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltics received bombs and strafing runs. The simultaneous strike sought a decisive result: destroy thousands of Soviet aircraft on the ground, nullify their response, and secure command of the air from day one. Runways, rows of planes without hardened shelters, fuel depots, and workshops were hit. Many Soviet pilots never reached their cockpits. Others took off under fire and fell within minutes for lack of coordination or due to tactical disadvantage. The psychological effect was immediate. The Luftwaffe seemed everywhere, turning Soviet roads and stations into permanent danger zones. On the ground, the front wasn't a solid wall, but a chain of strongpoints separated by weak stretches. Panzer divisions slipped between covering units, rolled into the rear, and left infantry to close the rings. In the north, columns pushed through Lithuania and Latvia, crossed the Dwina, and pointed toward Leningrad. In the center, the greatest armored mass cut through Belarus toward Minsk and Smolensk. In the south, Axis forces burst into Ukraine, eyeing Kiev and the rich Donbass. In days, the map changed color. Roads cut, units outflanked, command posts losing contact with subordinates. The Red Army, surprised despite the signs, tried to react. Some units fought hard on the frontier. Others fell apart under contradictory orders, failed communications, or sheer confusion. Instructions from Moscow arrived late or cancelled each other out. One general ordered, "Hold in place." Another demanded immediate counterattacks without concentration of forces. In that chaos, Soviet mechanized corps, still incomplete and plagued by maintenance issues, lurched toward the front. They lacked radios, spare parts, and fuel. Their commanders lacked experience in joint maneuver. Although the T-34 and KV tanks shocked with their armor and guns, their piecemeal employment kept them from changing the balance in the first week. The encirclement of Minsk became the opening milestone. Between June 22nd and 24th, Panzer Groups 2 and 3 broke border defenses and thrust deep from the south and north. On June 28th, Minsk fell. 2 days later, the armored spearheads linked up east of the city, closing the pincer and creating two pockets, Białystok and Minsk. The Soviet Western Front, composed of the 3rd, 10th, 13th, and parts of the 4th Army under Dmitry Pavlov, tried to resist the Panzer Groups and the German 9th and 4th Armies, but by July 9th, it had been defeated. The Luftwaffe bombed roads and junctions where Soviet columns tried to flee. Prisoners numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and together with the dead and wounded, the toll rose above 400,000. Surprise was measured not only in kilometers gained but in systems neutralized. The Soviet rail network, with its different gauge, became both a problem and an opportunity. For the Soviets, moving reserves forward from the depths took time. For the Germans, capturing stations and nodes let them sever entire regions. For now, the balance favored them. Air-ground coordination recalled France. Panel signals, assigned frequencies, and targets marked on maps updated several times a day. Smolensk was next. After Minsk, Panzer Groups 2 and 3 exploited gaps, swung south and north, and bagged more formations. Once again, hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were trapped. On the encirclement perimeters, German infantry fought house to house, forest to forest. Inside, Soviet groups tried to break east, sometimes with partial success, but at enormous cost. Each pocket didn't just destroy divisions. It wrecked their command chains, stripped away artillery, and left the Soviet 16th, 19th, and 20th armies with fewer experienced officers. In the south, the situation was complex due to the front's breadth and the mix of Axis forces. Army Group South, composed of the 1st Panzer Group, the 6th, 17th, and 11th armies, backed by the Luftwaffe and Romania's 3rd and 4th armies, was tasked with destroying the Soviet southwestern front and seizing Dnieper crossings on the way to Kiev and beyond Kharkiv and Crimea. Ukrainian farmers watched endless columns pass. Soviet administrations evacuated factories and archives when they could. Other times, the pace of the advance made it impossible. On the road to Leningrad, Army Group North under Wilhelm von Leeb pushed through the Baltic states. Here, Soviet withdrawals mixed with bursts of defense in cities and river crossings. The general pattern, however, favored the invaders. Tactical superiority, more flexible command, and better synchronization of arms. The first weeks cemented an impression. The Wehrmacht had repeated its blistering start. It destroyed thousands of aircraft, captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and broke layered defenses. German generals spoke with confidence about timelines and next objectives. Hitler visited maps and pushed arrows toward Moscow, Leningrad, and Ukraine. The Reichspress trumpeted historic victories and hinted the campaign might be over before the leaves fell. In headquarters, though, some logistics and transport officers warned of wear, blown tires, overheated engines, consumption beyond forecasts. Not an alarm, yet, but a margin note. By late July, the operation kept its pace. The Soviet front had been pierced and twisted. Minsk and then Smolensk had fallen. The Baltic states were nearly traversed. And in Ukraine, the Dnieper loomed as the next line of resistance. The key remained the same. Keep the momentum, close more pockets, deny the enemy a chance to catch his breath. The offensive of June 22nd didn't just launch a campaign, it changed the scale of the war. The conflict ceased to be a Western European affair and became a continental front, requiring millions of men and a constant flow of supplies. What began with dawn artillery and airfield bombings became, day after day, a sweeping advance across occupied Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltics. On the back of those successes, German leaders believed they had validated their prediction. The USSR would collapse before winter arrived. But growing resistance, logistical cracks, and strategic choices had yet to exact their price. As July wore on, the German offensive still moved, but not at the speed of the opening weeks. Soviet resistance, far from dissolving, thickened. At every river, every forest, every large village, improvised positions appeared, forcing the panzers to break, deploy, call for support, and only then resume the march. That constant friction began to consume the time the Wehrmacht thought it had to spare. Stalin, hesitant at first and clinging to caution, now took on a steel tone. Speeches and orders carried a single idea: total defense. Mass mobilizations were activated. Divisions were raised from recruits and reassembled veterans. Commissars were sent to harden discipline. The slogan, "Not one step back," became a mantra and threat. Soviet units held longer, counterattacked with more judgment, and traded ground for time. Sometimes they abandoned a city and blew bridges and depots behind them. Other times they fought house to house to bleed the attackers. The result was the same. German speed sagged. Logistics began dictating tempo. Supply lines stretched hundreds, then thousands of kilometers. Every liter of gasoline reaching the front had crossed rivers, half-mended bridges, and newly converted rail lines. Trains advanced with the problem of the Soviet gauge. Railway brigades worked without rest, but never at the pace needed. The vehicle fleet suffered, burst tires, seized engines, boiling radiators. Field workshops worked magic, but the flow of spares didn't always match. Quartermasters' reports turned sober, consumption above plan, reserves below desired levels. To that tension, Another factor was added that German doctrine couldn't ignore: partisans. In the rear, Soviet groups, stragglers and organized civilians began sabotaging the invaders' lifeline. A length of track blown here, a warehouse torched there, an ambush on a side road. At first, they seemed isolated incidents. Later, their frequency forced troop diversions, security units, and time spent on clearing operations. One delayed train, one scattered convoy, one wrecked station. Small wounds that added up made it harder to keep the offensive pulse. The Luftwaffe, dominant in the opening, remained decisive but no longer omnipresent. Airframes accumulated hours, forward fields needed maintenance, spares took longer to arrive. Distances to targets increased, reducing time over the objective and multiplying the need for refueling. Meanwhile, the Soviet air defense, crude but more than effective, began to annoy. German air superiority persisted, but at a higher cost. On land, geography itself interfered. Big rivers, the Dnieper, the Dvina, the Desna, forced careful operations. Seizing bridges intact became a priority. Failing that, pontoon bridges had to be laid and guarded against artillery and night attacks. A crossing could consume a full day and drain fuel dumps. Forests and marshes, especially in Belarus, channeled the advance along predictable corridors, good for movement, but awful if met by resistance. Meanwhile, the USSR refined its strategic response. The Soviets didn't just resist, they started to order their rear. Factory evacuations grew more methodical, command cadres were redistributed, and coordination between fronts improved. Reserves were no longer hurled in piecemeal but concentrated to plug critical penetrations. In some sectors, counterattacks were no longer suicidal, but calibrated to bite at armored spearheads or force German columns to pivot. The long summer Hitler expected as an ally became a clock counting down. Strategic objectives were still within reach, but no longer just around the corner. The German machine could keep hitting, but at a pace that no longer guaranteed total dislocation of the enemy in weeks. In the Reich headquarters, some generals pressed to concentrate on the center and go for Moscow. Others insisted on securing the flanks and the resources of the south. That strategic debate was the symptom of a looming reality. The quick campaign was slipping away. In early August 1941, the German offensive seemed to have two souls pulling in different directions. One pushed toward Moscow, convinced that taking the capital would break the Soviet spine. The other looked south, hungry for Ukraine, the Donbass, and beyond, Caucasus oil. On the map, both routes looked possible. In reality, the Reich didn't have infinite resources to pursue both with equal strength. What followed was a series of decisions that together blurred the initial clarity and set the Wehrmacht on a path of attrition it hadn't planned for. The first big turn came at Kiev. After the summer encirclements, Army Group Center had driven deep through Belarus toward Smolensk, opening the corridor to Moscow. Many operational commanders, seeing the capital within reach, wanted to keep punching east. But Hitler, true to his economic and ideological instinct, ordered forces diverted from the center to the south to close a giant pocket around Kiev. The reasoning was twofold: secure the flank, capture resources, and destroy more Soviet armies before turning on Moscow. Operationally, the maneuver worked. The massive pincer around Kiev netted hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops, one of the war's largest encirclement victories. Strategically, the price was time and fuel lost on the road to Moscow, just as the seasonal clock began to work against them. That detour rewrote the calendar. While the southern columns celebrated captures and grand communiques, the road to the capital cooled. The Soviets, battered but unbroken, used those weeks to reform lines, bring up reserves, and prepare new defenses. When pressure toward Moscow finally resumed, it was no longer late summer, it was the cusp of autumn, with its curse word for Eastern Front logisticians, Rasputitsa, looming on the horizon. Rasputitsa is mud that swallows vehicles, roads turned to rivers of clay, and bridges sagging under overloaded trucks. Autumn rains turned the plains into a sticky maze. Panzers designed for speed and maneuver now crawled. Trucks skidded. Horses sank. An operation that lived on velocity found that covering 100 kilometers could take days. Engineers worked without rest, laying planks, improving drainage and throwing pontoons. Even so, every meter cost. The Luftwaffe suffered too. Muddy fields, low visibility, and maintenance times that ballooned. Air superiority didn't vanish, but its ability to translate into constant support dropped. Logistics, already taut, became a three-dimensional puzzle. Converting rails to European gauge took time and labor. Without those rails, supply trains stalled far behind the front. Trucks tried to fill the gap and paid the price. Broken transmissions, bent frames, shredded tires. On saturated routes, one breakdown stopped entire columns. Fuel, plentiful in June, turned precious. Commanders had to choose: resupply the spearheads or keep the infantry moving, support one sector with artillery or save ammunition for the next obstacle. Each choice shrank the margin for the next. And as if mud weren't enough, the enemy wasn't the same as in June. With new commanders and lessons learned the hard way, the Red Army defended in greater depth. It didn't always stop the panzers, but it slowed them at key points, denied direct routes, and above all, forced constant expenditures of fuel and ammunition to break through. Counterattacks, less massive, more surgical, nipped at flanks, blew bridges, and forced columns to pivot. Soviet artillery, better concentrated, harassed assembly areas and vital crossings. In towns, squads with anti-tank rifles and Molotov cocktails turned intersections into traps. It all added minutes, hours, days. Then came the cruelest stage of the calendar, the Russian winter. In most German officers' minds, the original plan avoided this point. The campaign was supposed to be concluded before the snows. Any mopping up left would be disorganized remnants. Reality rewrote the script. By late autumn, temperatures plunged. First frosts hardened the mud, but soon ice and snow followed. Thermometers sank to -20, -30 degrees Celsius in places. What had been a slow advance turned into daily survival. Cold bit into flesh and machinery, weapons froze, lubricants and oils thickened, rifle bolts stuck, firing pins failed. Unless kept warm through endless rotations, engines wouldn't start in the morning. Batteries died. Soldiers, equipped for a short summer-autumn campaign, improvised with blankets, paper and straw in their boots. The shortage of proper winter clothing shattered the invincibility myth faster than any enemy speech. Fingers went numb on triggers. Night sentry duty became punishment. Illness spread. Frostbite, pneumonia, influenza. Field hospitals filled with casualties not from combat. In command posts, morale sagged. The promise of a short campaign had evaporated. The horizon was an endless white line. Reports no longer list pockets closed, but hold positions, repel counterattacks, await supplies. The Luftwaffe, constrained by weather and wear, couldn't compensate for low mobility on the ground. The enemy, by contrast, seemed adapted. Siberian troops arriving in the central sector wore parkas, felt boots, skis, and winter camouflage. Their rifles and machine guns, oiled with the right lubricants, worked. Above all, they fought with the energy of those defending their capital. Overstretched German lines became vulnerable. A company that once held a kilometer now covers 3. Gaps were plugged with isolated batteries, rear area platoons, and service troops turned infantry. Any Soviet penetration, even modest, threatened supply roads, depots, or command posts. Partisans in the rear didn't hibernate. They kept blowing tracks, torching stores, and ambushing convoys in forests where sound was swallowed by snow. Each lost train was one less week of fuel. Each ambushed convoy, one less artillery battery at the front. Cold also gripped coordination. Radios with weak batteries, antennas glazed with ice, operators with stiff fingers, command chains, already strained by distance, broke at the worst moments. Sappers fought to keep roads passable. Cooks could barely heat rations. Medics lacked basic supplies to treat frostbite and wounds that quickly. The very air felt like another enemy, unseen, relentless. Psychologically, the shock was hard. The image of a defeated summer enemy contrasted with the reality of an adversary counterattacking in winter. German soldiers who had expected to rest in captured cities found themselves digging trenches in frozen ground, building shelters from boards and tarps, trying to coax stoves to life on rationed gasoline. Home by Christmas turned into a bitter joke. Letters spoke of cold, of boots that never dried, of fingers that no longer felt, of nights where one mistake cost a life. None of this meant the Wehrmacht collapsed overnight. In many sectors, its discipline and experience held coherent lines. Despite disagreements with Hitler, its officers organized layered defenses and local counterattacks to seal breaches. But the offensive momentum that defined Barbarossa was gone. The machine that lived on speed was now anchored by weather, logistics, and an enemy that no longer yielded space so easily. In early December 1941, with thermometers biting below -20 degrees Celsius, the German offensive against Moscow, Operation Typhoon, was spent. In some sectors, armored spearheads could see the winter glow of the capital on the horizon, but they lacked fuel, ammunition, and warm clothing. Divisions had been thinned by weeks of marching and fighting. Engines failed, weapons froze. On the other side, the USSR gritted its teeth and assembled at great sacrifice a decisive reserve. It was time to turn the tide. From the Soviet High Command, Georgy Zhukov and other commanders coordinated a continental-scale response. The plan wasn't a lightning rupture, but to shove the Germans away from the capital, wear down their units, and prove that the myth of their invincibility had limits. The most visible piece was the Siberian and Far Eastern troops, hardened by extreme climates, fully winter-equipped, and practiced in snow combat. Their arrival reinforced key sectors with fresh infantry, plentiful artillery ammunition, and ski units able to move where vehicles bogged down. On December 5, 1941, Soviet fronts around Moscow opened fire and advanced, not with a single blow, but with a series of coordinated attacks along a wide arc, from Kalinin in the north, past Klin, Solnechnogorsk, Istra, and Volokolamsk, down to Tula in the south. Early gains were modest, but meaningful. Where Germans had companies holding stretches that required battalions, the Soviets found gaps. Where defenses were held together by improvisation and hold at all costs orders, steady pressure forced withdrawals. White bayonets literally drove into thin lines of an enemy who, for the first time in the East, was shoved back by sustained blows he couldn't answer with textbook armored counterstrokes. Tactical surprise wasn't total, but the force and persistence were. Siberian units attacked in felt boots, parkas, white camouflage, and on skis. Artillery, prepared for cold, kept up high rates of fire. Mortars thundered in frozen towns. The Soviet air arm, more limited, used weather windows to harass concentrations and road junctions. In parallel, partisans stepped up rear area sabotage, cutting rails and ambushing convoys trying to sustain the line. In many sectors, the German retreat wasn't a rout, but a chain of urgent pullbacks, first to the next defensible village, then to the next river, and later to a line penciled on the operations map. The problem was that the map table itself was under political strain. On December 19, 1941, Hitler took direct command of the army after dismissing Walter von Brauchitsch. It wasn't symbolic. From then on, he issued more operational orders, especially one: no withdrawals of significance without his authorization. Not a step back, here, became the Führer's political instruction to his generals and clashed with frontline reality. In more than a few cases, holding meant sacrificing entire units that could have been saved by a timely retreat. Far from neutralizing advantages, the weather accentuated the edge of the better-prepared defender. Soviets used sleds to move ammunition, skis to reconnoiter and flank, and their troops experienced to operate in temperatures that paralyzed the foe. Their weapons were lubricated properly. Their blankets and greatcoats prevented extreme frostbite losses. When visibility fell, they advanced through woods and hollows, guided by locals or scouts who knew the ground. Night patrols, silent over snow, slipped between positions, cut wires, took prisoners, and sowed uncertainty. Strategically, the counteroffensive had two immediate effects. First, it saved Moscow. The capital would not fall that winter. Its value was political, economic, and psychological. The command center, the rail nexus, and local industry stayed in Soviet hands. Second, it forced the Wehrmacht to absorb a new reality. It no longer set the pace everywhere. As December turned into January 1942, the arrows on German maps, which had always pointed east, began to curve west in several sectors. Hitler reacted with a mix of intransigence and centralization. He refused broad withdrawal permissions, relieved commanders who proposed elastic maneuvers, and ordered the holding of positions that, on the ground, were untenable. The result was bitter. A few points were saved at high cost. Elsewhere, Soviet ruptures congealed into salients that later complicated the entire line. For German soldiers, the message was clear: hold or die. For the Soviets, the reading was the opposite. For the first time, the enemy seemed tied down by his own political doctrine, and that offered operational openings. The counteroffensive didn't turn the entire front into a disorderly German retreat. In plenty of sectors, Axis defenses stabilized through the brutal winter, thanks to discipline, mid-level leadership, and still effective artillery. The Red Army suffered too, advancing through deep snow with stretched logistics and a battered motor pool exacted a price. But the strategic aim was achieved: remove the immediate threat to the capital and prove that, with preparation and reserves, the Wehrmacht could be pushed. It was the first great halt in Barbarossa's path, a sign that the German monster could bleed, that climate and will could break Blitzkrieg's inertia, and that the Eastern Front would no longer be a theater of quick victories, but a prolonged struggle where each season weighed as much as an army. On that new board, the December 1941 counteroffensive was more than a shove. It was the beginning of the long turn of the tide. When the Soviet counteroffensive of December 1941 drove the Wehrmacht away from Moscow, something deeper than a front line shifted in Europe. The myth of German invincibility broke. For 2 years, the Reich had strung together lightning victories: Warsaw, Paris, Belgrade, Athens. Barbarossa seemed set to repeat that sequence on a grander scale. The stop at the Soviet capital upended the narrative. In Berlin, propaganda searched for new formulas, no longer promising short campaigns, but heroic resistance to winter and swelling hordes. For the Allies, the message flipped. Germany could be stopped. Its machine had limits. Its calendar could be broken. War in the East changed in nature. What began as a shock offensive turned into a brutal war of attrition. The Germans had initiative and the ability to concentrate power at critical points. Now, they faced vast distances, a USSR that had shown it could raise new armies, and a climate that punished every delay. Soviet industry, barely evacuated in the summer, was now producing T-34s, guns, ammunition, and trucks. Losses were immense on both sides, but the determinant became replacement. The Soviet state proved it could replenish men and materiel at a rate the blockaded Germany could not match. From 1942 onward, operations ceased to be races and became mills, offensives that chewed resources for months, defenses prepared in layers, battles that decided little by themselves but exhausted whoever couldn't sustain them. Within this frame, racial extermination policies in occupied territories accelerated and became a system. Barbarossa wasn't only a military plan, it carried an ideological program. The racial war set out in directives and secret orders became practice. Mass executions of Jews by Einsatzgruppen and collaborators, murders of political commissars, deportations, deliberate hunger in besieged cities, and POW camps. The occupied rear was organized to extract resources and labor while annihilating entire communities labeled enemies. These weren't just crimes. They had a military impact. They fueled local resistance, multiplied partisans, and slammed shut any door to durable collaboration with populations that might have been neutral or even hostile to Moscow. Instead of pacifying, indiscriminate violence turned every forest into a partisan haven and every village into an intelligence node for the Red Army. By sheer scale and ferocity, the Eastern Front eclipsed all others. From 1941 to 1942 on, Eastern Europe absorbed most German divisions, its best armored formations, and a huge share of its air power. It also consumed what was most precious: fuel, ammunition, spares, veteran cadres. Campaigns in North Africa, for example, would always make do with what was left after the East was supplied. That concentration had a multiplier effect. Every setback on the Soviet front translated into global weaknesses for the Reich. When rail supply failed, through sabotage or simple saturation, the whole chain sagged. The German economy, already under strain, had to feed several wars in one, but the East devoured resources like no other theater. For the Soviets, the gains were strategic and symbolic. Moscow stood. The capital's rail network kept functioning. The government retained its political center. Soviet propaganda made the most of it. The Great Patriotic War ceased to be a defensive slogan and became a promise of future victory. The army, still clumsy in many areas, gained confidence. By paying unbearable losses, cadres learned to combine infantry, artillery, tanks, and, when weather allowed, air power. Fronts solidified, procedures standardized, from mine-laying to deploying Katyusha batteries. Every month of resistance let relocated production grow, cadres train, and logistics stabilize through winter with sleds and railways no longer under constant bombing. Occupied Europe felt the tremor. In the Balkans, Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine, resistance grew bolder. Soviet successes and proof that Germany wasn't invincible energized sabotage, clandestine networks, and cross-cooperation with Allied intelligence. In Finland and Romania, the Eastern War also set national agendas. Losses and limits stood out more starkly. In London and Washington, the strategic calculus hardened. Supporting the USSR wasn't a sunk cost. It was an investment that wore down the main enemy. Lend-Lease found growing justification, and although its biggest material effects would come in 1942 to 1943, its political momentum was born of this winter. Finally, the German economy and society entered a different phase. Sustaining the East demanded more industrial mobilization, more labor, more extraordinary measures. Soviet imports from 1939 to 1941, once easing bottlenecks, were gone. Agriculture had to compete with industry for workers. Rail transport prioritized military trains. Cities felt tighter rationing. If the plan had been to conquer resources to relieve the blockade, the result of 1941 was the opposite. The invasion opened a wound that bled resources without tapping the promised source. In that paradox, the war changed phase. No longer a bold stroke to decide everything, but a trial of endurance in which the side that produced and withstood more would win. The immediate balance of Barbarossa can be sketched in 4 broad strokes. First, the aura of German invincibility was shattered. Second, the Eastern Front became the great sinkhole of men and material for the entire war. Third, ideology drove criminal policies that ignited resistance and made stable occupation impossible. Fourth, the USSR, far from collapsing, shifted into total mobilization that, over time, would flip the balance. Operation Barbarossa was conceived as a lightning conquest, but ended up as Hitler's greatest strategic error. It upended the world's balance, ignited the deadliest front in history, and marked the start of the Third Reich's collapse. An invasion meant to dominate the East, that ultimately buried the Nazi Empire.